Hello and welcome to this edition of Municipal Monday. This is your resource for local governments on legislative issues that will impact not just the state, but for Alaska's cities and boroughs. My name is Nils Andreasen. I'm the Executive Director of the Alaska Municipal League. And this week's discussion is really going to focus on the effort by Senate Finance to come to grips with where the state of Alaska's financials are and how, and I hope to talk a little bit about how they're important to local governments. I think one of the big takeaways from me in the Senate Finance conversations, and I would commend any of the Senate Finance meetings to all members. I think they're a great way to learn about where the state's at, how the administration is approaching its budgeting process and expenditures, and the relationship between the legislature and the administration. And you can kind of tell what that looks like through some of the questions and comments by Senate Finance Committee members. But the Senate Finance last week started, as it usually does, with oil production and prices. And I think that's a fascinating way, kind of a lens through which to look at the state's overall budget. Because traditionally the state's budget has been paid for from oil revenues. And we know that that's changed in recent years with the POMV, the percent of market value that was implemented just a few years back. And so we see a portion of the permanent fund being allocated to fund state government as well, smoothing out the ups and downs of oil production and prices. But I think it's really critical to know that the Senate Finance starts its session with looking at oil. And I guess one of the reasons I think that's interesting is because it's a piece of the picture. And back in 2015, when we were also still wrestling with fiscal crisis, there were slides out there, I think by Commissioner Navarre, that pointed to everything else that's not oil and gas revenue, and functionally to Alaska's GDP that is comprised of so much more. And I think it would be interesting to start a legislative session with a state that was focused on Alaska's economic activity. And it's not connected to that activity because it doesn't have a broad-based revenue. So where Senate Finance starts is because that's what's most important to it. It's been oil and gas revenue, and it's now a permanent fund earnings. And I hope that we'll get to a place, not just as a state, but for all of us to be thinking about how do we grow this seed corn? How do we get Alaska's GDP to the same goal that we've attributed to the permanent fund, and together they reach $100 billion in as quick a time as possible. And I think for both, what are the kinds of investments necessary to get there? And these questions are important because for local governments, that's where we start. We start with what does the health of our economy look like? What's our tax base? How will bed and sales and property taxes play out over this coming year? And in the midst of these budget discussions that I know also local governments are having, the health of the economy is paramount. And not just on the consequences of what comes from government decision making, but really the connection between that economy and the funding of those local governments. So I'm looking forward to continued conversations with the state about how to meet its revenue shortfall and how to really leverage effectively the GDP beyond just the single sector that we've traditionally focused on. Thank you for joining us for this Municipal Monday. I know that local governments are focused on not just their budgets and not just the state's budget, but on the health of Alaska's economy and hoping for a quick economic recovery. But thank you for watching this week's segment. I hope you join us again next week. Because an informed Alaska is a greater Alaska.